March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. Kapitän See Heinrich Vollmer stood on the bridge of the transport ship Kembu Maru, scanning the horizon through salt-stained binoculars. Behind him, 7 more vessels plowed through the choppy waters, their holds packed with 7,000 Japanese soldiers and enough supplies to sustain them for months. The convoy had survived 2 days at sea, navigating through Allied-controlled waters with only minor harassment from distant reconnaissance aircraft. Vollmer allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. By nightfall, they would reach Leh, unload their precious cargo, and the Japanese garrison there would be reinforced. The mission would be complete. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then he saw them, low on the horizon, skimming just above the wave tops. Not the high-altitude bombers he had prepared for, but something different, something that made his stomach clench with primal fear. They came in fast, impossibly fast, their twin engines roaring as they closed the distance. These were not the lumbering heavy bombers that attacked from safe altitudes. These aircraft were hunting at sea level, and they were coming straight for his convoy. Vollmer barely had time to shout a warning before the first aircraft opened fire. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced in 2 years of naval convoy duty. Not the whistle of falling bombs, but the buzzsaw scream of dozens of heavy machine guns firing simultaneously. The sea around his ship erupted in fountains of white water as tracer rounds walked toward the hull. Then came impacts, the distinctive clang of 50-caliber bullets tearing through steel plating like paper. The aircraft roared overhead so close that Vollmer could see the pilot's face, could read the nose art painted on the fuselage. Then it was gone, banking hard to line up another pass. Behind it came another aircraft, and another, the sky filled with twin-engined attackers, each one spitting fire, each one hunting for kills. In the chaos of those first seconds, as alarm bells screamed and anti-aircraft guns struggled to track targets moving far too fast and far too low, Vollmer realized with crystalline clarity that everything he knew about air defense was obsolete. These Americans had changed the rules, and his convoy was about to pay the price. This is the story of how 8 ships vanished from the sea in just 15 minutes, victims of a radical new form of aerial warfare that emerged from desperation, innovation, and the unique demands of the Pacific theater. It is a story of American aviators who transformed a medium bomber into a ship-killing predator, of a German naval officer serving with Japanese forces who watched his entire command disintegrate, and of how tactical innovation can render traditional defenses meaningless in the span of a single engagement. But more than tactics and technology, this is a story about the men who fought in the forgotten corner of World War II, in the sweltering heat of the South Pacific, where survival depended on adaptation and where conventional wisdom often meant death. To understand how Kapitän Vollmer found himself commanding a doomed convoy in the Bismarck Sea, we need to step back 18 months, to the fall of 1941, when the world map was being redrawn by Axis victories. By December 1941, Japan had seized vast territories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The speed and scope of their conquests shocked the world. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies all fell in rapid succession. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. Their doctrine of aggressive offensive warfare overwhelmed colonial defenses that had grown complacent during peacetime. New Guinea became a critical battleground in this expanding conflict. The massive island, second largest in the world, sat like a shield north of Australia. If Japan could secure New Guinea, they would control the approaches to Australia.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Australia itself, and threatened the vital sea lanes connecting America to its only major ally in the Southwest Pacific. The Japanese recognized this strategic importance and moved swiftly to establish bases along New Guinea's northern coast. Towns like Lae and Salamaua became staging points for further operations, their harbors filled with transports bringing troops and supplies. But supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean are vulnerable, and the Japanese soon learned that holding territory meant maintaining a constant flow of reinforcements and materiel. Every bullet, every bag of rice, every replacement soldier had to arrive by ship or aircraft. The distances involved were staggering. Convoys departing from Rabaul, the massive Japanese base on New Britain, faced several days at sea before reaching New Guinea. During those days, they were exposed to Allied air and naval attack. For the Allies, interdicting these supply convoys became a strategic priority. Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, understood that Japanese garrisons cut off from resupply would wither. The problem was execution. Allied air forces in 1942 lacked the capability to effectively attack shipping. High-altitude bombing, the standard doctrine, proved wildly inaccurate against moving ships. Pilots reported excellent results, claiming hits and sinks that reconnaissance later revealed were pure imagination. Bombs dropped from 20,000 feet rarely hit even stationary targets. Against vessels that could maneuver, the hit rate approached zero. Torpedo bombers offered better accuracy, but required slow, low-level approaches that made them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Japanese convoy escorts had grown skilled at shooting down torpedo planes, and losses among Allied aircrews mounted. Something had to change. The mathematics of high-altitude bombing were unforgiving. A bomb dropped from 4 miles up took almost 30 seconds to fall. In that time, a ship traveling at 15 knots moved nearly 250 yards. Even if the bombardier calculated perfectly, accounting for wind, altitude, airspeed, and target motion, the ship could alter course during those 30 seconds and the bombs would miss. Some bombardiers became quite skilled, achieving hit rates of perhaps 5% under ideal conditions. But 5% meant 95% of bombs wasted, and the Allies could not afford such inefficiency. Enter Major Paul Gunn, an American civilian pilot who had been caught in the Philippines when war broke out. Gunn managed to escape to Australia, where he joined the Army Air Forces. Gunn was not a traditional military officer. He was a mechanic, a tinkerer, a man who looked at problems from unconventional angles. When told that B-25 Mitchell medium bombers could not effectively attack shipping, Gunn asked a simple question: why not? The standard answer involved bombing doctrine, training procedures, and the limitations of existing equipment. Gunn ignored all of that. He looked at the B-25 and saw potential that others had missed. The B-25 Mitchell was a solid aircraft, sturdy and reliable, powered by 2 Wright Cyclone engines that gave it respectable speed and range. It carried a crew of 6 and was designed as a medium bomber, attacking from moderate altitudes with a bomb load of up to 3,000 pounds. But Gunn saw something else. He saw a stable gun platform with plenty of internal space and 2 powerful engines that could push it to over 270 miles per hour at low altitude. What if, Gunn proposed, instead of bombing from above, the B-25 attacked at sea level? What if they turned it into a giant strafer? The idea was not entirely original. Fighter aircraft had been strafing ground targets since World War I, but fighters carried limited ammunition and small-caliber guns. What Gunn envisioned was something unprecedented. A medium bomber, much larger and more robust than any fighter, bristling with forward-firing guns and making attack runs at wave-top height. The firepower would be devastating, and accuracy would be guaranteed because the pilot aimed the entire aircraft at the target.
Gunn began modifying B-25s in Australia, working with whatever resources he could scrounge. He removed the bombardier position in the nose and installed 450 caliber machine guns, all firing forward. He added more guns in packages mounted on the sides of the nose. Eventually, some aircraft carried 8 forward-firing 50 calibers, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. The math was staggering. 8 guns times 800 rounds per minute meant 6,400 bullets per minute, or more than 100 rounds every second. When Gunn test-fired his creation, the recoil from all guns firing simultaneously actually slowed the aircraft noticeably. But firepower alone was not enough. Gunn and others, including Major Edward Larner, worked on tactics. They developed the concept of skip bombing, a technique that turned medium bombers into giant shotguns. The principle was elegant. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude and hoping they hit, aircraft would approach at very low level, sometimes as low as 50 feet, and release bombs that would skip across the water like stones, striking the target's hull at or below the waterline. The bombs were fitted with delayed fuses so they would penetrate the hull before detonating, maximizing damage. Skip bombing required nerve. Pilots had to fly straight at their targets through intense anti-aircraft fire, hold course until the last possible moment, release their bombs, and then pull up sharply to avoid flying into their own blast. The margin for error was non-existent. Too high and the bombs would not skip properly. Too low and the aircraft might hit the water. Release too early and the bombs would fall short. Release too late and the aircraft might be caught in the explosion. It was precision flying under the worst possible conditions, and it demanded pilots with steady hands and steel nerves. By early 1943, several units in the Southwest Pacific were equipped with modified B-25s and trained in these new tactics. The 3rd Attack Group, the 38th Bomb Group, and the 90th Bomb Group all fielded Strafer variants. Crews practiced skip bombing on wrecked ships and floating targets until the techniques became second nature. They learned to come in low, to attack in coordinated waves, to saturate targets with gunfire before releasing bombs. They learned which parts of a ship were most vulnerable and how to maximize damage with limited ordnance. Intelligence officers studied Japanese convoy tactics, learning their routes, their timing, their escort procedures. They identified Rabaul as the primary departure point for convoys heading to New Guinea and established patrol patterns to detect ships leaving that massive base. The pieces were falling into place. The Allies had developed a new weapon system specifically designed to destroy shipping. Now they needed a target worthy of the effort. That target emerged in late February 1943 when intelligence detected a major convoy preparing at Rabaul. The Japanese were planning a massive reinforcement operation, sending thousands of troops to Lae to strengthen their position on New Guinea. This was exactly the kind of high-value target Allied commanders had been waiting for. If the convoy could be destroyed, Japanese plans for New Guinea would be crippled. The garrison at Lae would remain weak, vulnerable to Allied counterattack. The balance of power in the Southwest Pacific theater might shift decisively. The convoy that departed Rabaul on February 28th was formidable. 8 transports, each loaded with soldiers and supplies. The troop carriers included the Kembu Maru, Teyo Maru, Nojima Maru, Kyokuse Maru, Ayo Maru, Oigoa Maru, Shinai Maru, and Taimei Maru. Together, they carried approximately 7,000 troops from the 51st Division, along with equipment, ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Everything needed to sustain a reinforced garrison for months of operations. Protecting this precious cargo was a substantial escort force. 8 destroyers accompanied the transports, their primary mission to screen against submarine attack and provide anti-aircraft defense. These were experienced warships firing a mix of 5-inch and 25mm anti-aircraft guns. With veteran crews, the destroyer Shikanami served as the escort commander's flagship. Alongside it sailed Uranami, Shirayuki, Tokichokaze, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Arashio, and Asashio. Each destroyer mounted multiple anti-aircraft guns and carried experienced gunners who had survived years of combat. The Japanese were taking no chances with this convoy. Too much depended on its safe arrival.
Command of the convoy's transport element fell to Kapitän zur See Heinrich Vollmer, a German naval officer serving as an advisor to the Japanese Navy. His presence aboard a Japanese convoy in the South Pacific requires explanation. Germany and Japan were allies, but they fought separate wars on opposite sides of the globe. German officers serving with Japanese forces were rare, usually military attachés or technical advisors. Vollmer's assignment reflected both nations' recognition that expertise should be shared among allies. Vollmer had commanded merchant raiders in the Atlantic during 1940 and 1941, preying on Allied shipping with considerable success. He understood convoy operations intimately, both from the perspective of a raider hunting convoys and as an officer responsible for protecting merchant vessels. His experience made him valuable to the Japanese, who respected German naval expertise. When the Imperial Japanese Navy requested an advisor for convoy operations, Vollmer had been assigned to the role. He had arrived in Rabaul 3 months earlier and had spent that time studying Japanese convoy doctrine, learning their procedures and offering suggestions based on his Atlantic experience. The Japanese listened politely to his recommendations, but rarely implemented them. Their convoy tactics emphasized speed and tight formations, with heavy reliance on destroyer escorts for protection. Vollmer advocated for more dispersed formations and better air cover, but such suggestions implied criticism of established doctrine, and the Japanese officers were too proud to accept that their methods might be flawed. As the convoy steamed south from Rabaul, Vollmer stood on Kembu Maru's bridge and felt uneasy. The formation was too tight, ships practically in each other's wake. If attacked, they would have little room to maneuver. Air cover consisted of periodic fighter sweeps, but those fighters could not remain overhead constantly. They had limited range and needed to return to base for fuel. That meant periods of vulnerability when the convoys sailed unprotected. Vollmer had seen what happened to unprotected convoys in the Atlantic. The results were never good. The first day passed without incident. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy and shadowed it, maintaining contact and reporting position, course, and speed back to Allied bases. Vollmer knew they were being tracked. Everyone knew. The question was what the Allies would do about it. Experience suggested high-altitude bombing attacks, easily defeated by maneuver and anti-aircraft fire. Perhaps a torpedo plane strike at dawn or dusk when visibility favored the attackers. The destroyers were prepared for both scenarios. Their crews were at battle stations throughout daylight hours, guns manned, lookouts scanning the sky. On March 2nd, the attacks began. B-17 flying fortresses appeared overhead, their contrails visible at 20,000 feet. They made bombing runs, releasing their loads from altitude. Vollmer watched the bombs fall, black specks growing larger. The destroyers and transports maneuvered frantically, throwing their rudders hard over, churning wakes white as they twisted and turned. The bombs missed. They always missed. Some landed hundreds of yards away, raising enormous waterspouts but doing no damage. A few fell closer, close enough that the concussion could be felt through the hull, but none scored hits. The B-17 crews reported successful attacks and flew home. The convoy sailed on, its captains confident in their ability to evade high-altitude bombing. That confidence would prove fatal. Because the B-17 attack was merely reconnaissance in force, a way to confirm the convoy's position and observe its defenses. The real attack
was coming, and it would be nothing like anything the Japanese had experienced before. Allied air commanders at Port Moresby were coordinating a massive strike, assembling every available aircraft for a maximum effort. They were about to unleash guns modified strafers in combat for the first time against a major target. The convoy in the Bismarck Sea represented the perfect opportunity to test their new tactics, and Allied commanders were determined to make the most of it. The planning was meticulous. Reconnaissance had provided detailed information about the convoy's composition, speed, and course. Weather forecasters predicted a front moving through the area, with low clouds and rain squalls that would provide cover for low-level attacks. Fighter escorts were arranged to suppress Japanese air cover. Bomber waves were scheduled to arrive in sequence, hitting the convoy repeatedly and giving it no respite. Everything that could be controlled was controlled. The rest would depend on the skill and courage of the air crews. March 3rd dawned overcast, exactly as forecast. Low clouds hugged the sea surface, visibility reduced by intermittent rain squalls. Vollmer scanned the gray sky and felt his unease deepen. Weather like this favored attackers. Aircraft could approach unseen until they were almost on top of the convoy, emerging from clouds with little warning. He alerted the destroyer captains, recommending heightened vigilance. They acknowledged his concerns but seemed unconcerned. After all, they had survived the previous day's attacks without loss. Why should today be different? At mid-morning, the convoy's formation remained tight. 8 transports in 2 columns, with destroyers positioned on the flanks and ahead as pickets. Speed was 12 knots, a compromise between fuel efficiency and the need to reach Leh quickly. Vollmer checked the chart again. They were perhaps 200 miles from their destination, still well within range of Allied airfields. If Allies intended a serious attack, it would come soon, while the convoy was still far from the protection of land-based fighters at Leh. He ordered lookouts to watch the horizon and particularly the cloud bases. Any attack would emerge from there. He did not have to wait long. At 10:15 hours, a lookout screamed a warning. Aircraft, low on the water, coming fast from the south. Vollmer snapped his binoculars up and felt his blood freeze. These were not high-altitude bombers. These were coming in at wave-top height, and there were dozens of them. The convoy's anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately, tracer rounds arcing out toward the approaching aircraft. Too late, Vollmer realized the fundamental problem. The guns were positioned and trained for high-altitude threats. Depressing them to engage targets barely above the sea surface was difficult, and the speed of the attacking aircraft made tracking nearly impossible. Gunners fired frantically, but their shots went wide, tracers passing above or below the targets. The first B-25 reached the convoy's perimeter and opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns created a storm of bullets, each one capable of penetrating steel plating. The pilot aimed at a transport directly ahead, holding his course steady as his guns hammered. Vollmer watched in horrified fascination as the sea in front of the targeted ship boiled white, then as the bullet stream walked up onto the hull. Metal screamed as rounds punched through plating. Windows shattered. Superstructure disintegrated. Men on deck simply vanished, cut down by the withering fire. The B-25 held its course until the last possible second, then dropped 2 bombs. They fell almost lazily, bouncing once on the water surface before skipping forward. They struck the transport's hull just above the waterline and penetrated before detonating with muffled crumps. The ship shuddered, smoke and debris erupting from the impact points. The B-25 roared overhead, its engine screaming, and banked hard to line up another target. But it was not alone. Behind it came another strafer, and another, and another.
Another. The sky filled with attacking aircraft, each one hunting for kills. The convoy's neat formation disintegrated as captains threw their ships into emergency turns, trying desperately to evade. But there was nowhere to go. The ships were too close together, their maneuverability limited. Where one ship turned to avoid an attacker, it presented its broadside to another. The Strafers exploited every opening, their pilots demonstrating skill born from months of training. Vollmer gripped the bridge railing as Kembu Maru's captain ordered hard to port. The ship heeled over, its rudder straining. Too slowly, much too slowly. A B-25 lined up on their bow, its nose guns winking orange. The strafing run began 1,000 yards out and closed with terrifying speed. Bullets walked across the water, then climbed onto Kembu Maru's forward deck. Men scattered, but many were too slow. The gunfire sounded like hail on a tin roof, an endless metallic clattering punctuated by screams. Then came the bombs. Vollmer saw them release, saw them hit the water and skip. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the sound died in his throat. The bombs struck amidships, one on each side.
The delayed fuses gave them time to penetrate deep into the hull before detonating. When they exploded, the ship convulsed as if struck by a giant fist. The blast tore through bulkheads, ruptured fuel lines, ignited fires. Kembu Maru slowed immediately, its engines damaged, steam venting from split pipes. Around him, Vollmer watched his convoy die. The See Maru took a direct hit from skip bombs that broke its back, the ship sagging in the middle as its spine fractured. It would sink in less than 10 minutes. The Nojima Maru burned furiously after incendiary rounds ignited fuel stores, black smoke pouring from its superstructure. The Kyokusei Maru listed heavily to starboard, its hull holed below the waterline by multiple bomb hits. Water rushed into the lower compartments faster than pumps could handle. The destroyers fought back as best they could, their anti-aircraft guns firing continuously. But they were designed to engage high-altitude bombers and torpedo planes making slow, predictable approaches. The Strafers came in fast, low, and from multiple directions simultaneously. Tracking them was nearly impossible. Hitting them required luck more than skill. A few B-25s took damage, limping away trailing smoke, but most pressed their attacks home and escaped unscathed. The attack lasted 15 minutes from first shots to final bombs. 15 minutes that felt like hours, a compressed eternity of noise and terror and death. When the Strafers finally withdrew, climbing back into the cloud cover and heading south toward their bases, they left behind a scene of utter devastation. Of the 8 transports that had departed Rebel confident in their destroyer escort and anti-aircraft defenses, not one remained combat effective. All 8 were sinking or crippled beyond recovery. Kembu Maru, Vollmer's flagship, was settling by the stern, its engine room flooded. He gave the order to abandon ship, and crew and soldiers scrambled into lifeboats and over the side. The water was warm but offered no comfort. Oil slicks spread across the surface, iridescent in patches where fuel leaked from ruptured tanks. Debris floated everywhere: life jackets, equipment, pieces of ships, and bodies. So many bodies. Vollmer clung to a piece of wreckage and watched Kembu Maru slide under, its bow rising high before it plunged into the depths. Around him, other transports were going down. The See Maru had already disappeared. The Nojima Maru rolled onto its side, men sliding off its tilted deck into the sea before capsizing completely. The Kyokusei Maru burned like a torch, ammunition cooking off in sporadic explosions. Its death throes took longer, but the outcome was inevitable. The destroyers raced between the sinking transports, pulling survivors from the water, but there were too many men and too few destroyers. Thousands of soldiers and sailors thrashed in the water, screaming for rescue. The destroyers did what they could, but they also had to prepare for the inevitable follow-up attack.
Allies would not let them rescue survivors unmolested. Sure enough, within an hour, more aircraft appeared. This time they were fighters, strafing the destroyers and forcing them to maneuver defensively, abandoning rescue efforts. Over the next 2 days, the slaughter continued. Japanese destroyers tried to evacuate survivors, but Allied aircraft harassed them constantly. More strafer attacks, more bombing runs, more strafing of men in the water. The Bismarck Sea became a graveyard. Of the 7,000 troops embarked on the convoy, fewer than 3,000 reached shore. The rest drowned or died from exposure or wounds. The 8 transports were total losses, resting on the seabed with their cargoes of weapons and supplies. 4 destroyers were sunk in the follow-up attacks, cut down by bombs and torpedoes as they tried to rescue survivors. Kapitän See Heinrich Vollmer survived. He was pulled from the water by the destroyer Yukikaze on the afternoon of March 4th, suffering from exposure but alive. He would spend the rest of the war as an advisor at Rabaul, watching as Allied air power slowly strangled Japanese operations in the region. He never commanded another convoy. The trauma of watching his entire command destroyed in 15 minutes left scars that time never healed. In reports filed after the battle, he tried to explain what had happened, to warn other officers about the new American tactics.
But the magnitude of the disaster was so complete that many in the Japanese high command refused to believe it. 8 transports lost to air attack? Impossible. Surely Vollmer exaggerated, or perhaps failed in his duties as convoy commander. But it was all true. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it came to be called, represented a watershed moment in the Pacific War. It demonstrated conclusively that Japanese convoys could be destroyed by air power alone, that their anti-aircraft defenses were inadequate against low-level attacks, and that the Allies had developed tactics that rendered traditional convoy protection obsolete. From March 1943 forward, Japanese logistics in the Southwest Pacific became a nightmare. Every convoy faced the threat of strafer attack. Losses mounted, garrison became isolated, their supplies dwindling. The strategic initiative shifted decisively to the Allies. For the men of the strafer squadrons, the Bismarck Sea was vindication. Their unconventional tactics and modified aircraft had achieved results beyond anyone's expectations. Major Paul Gunn became something of a legend, the maverick engineer whose crazy ideas had worked spectacularly. More B-25s were modified into strafers. The techniques were refined and taught to new crews. Skip bombing and low-level strafing became standard doctrine for anti-shipping strikes. But the human cost was immense. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors died in the Bismarck Sea, many of them drowning or succumbing to exposure as they waited for rescue that never came. Some American air crews struggled with what they had done, the memory of strafing men in the water, of watching ships full of human beings sink beneath the waves. War requires killing, but the wholesale slaughter of a convoy felt different somehow, more industrial, less personal. The battle also highlighted the brutal nature of the Pacific War, where mercy was rare and survival often meant killing without hesitation. Allied pilots who considered sparing survivors in the water were reminded that those men, if rescued, would fight again at places like Tarawa or Saipan. The mathematics of war were cold and unforgiving. Every enemy soldier killed here was one less enemy to face in the next battle. Compassion was a luxury neither side could afford. Yet even in that cold calculation, there was tragedy. Most of the soldiers aboard those transports were conscripts, young men drafted into service, sent to fight in a war they barely understood, on an island they had never heard of until receiving their orders. They died not because they were evil or because they deserved death, but because they were on the wrong ships in
The wrong place at the wrong time, when tactical innovation met strategic opportunity. The legacy of the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. It forced a complete re-evaluation of anti-shipping warfare and demonstrated that doctrinal innovation could achieve results that raw numbers could not. The strafer concept spread to other theaters. In Europe, B-25s and A-20 Havocs were modified for similar missions, attacking German shipping in the Mediterranean and along the coast of France. The principles pioneered in the Pacific found application worldwide. For convoy commanders everywhere, the battle served as a grim warning. Traditional defensive measures, anti-aircraft guns positioned for high-altitude threats, destroyer escorts screening against submarines, tight formations for mutual support. All these were inadequate against the new threat. Low-level strafers coming in fast with overwhelming firepower could tear through convoy defenses before those defenses could effectively respond. New tactics had to be developed, but that took time, and time was measured in sinking ships and drowning men. Lieutenant Thomas Hendricks pulled back on the yoke and felt his B-25 climb away from the convoy, the aircraft shuddering from the recoil of 8 50-caliber guns firing in unison. Below him, a transport ship was breaking apart, its midsection collapsing as fire spread through compartments that moments before had housed living men. He had seen the soldiers on deck scattering as his guns found their mark, had watched tracer rounds tear through metal and flesh with equal indifference. The skip bombs he released had struck true, penetrating the hull before detonating deep inside where they would do maximum damage.
It was textbook execution of the tactics they had drilled for months. Perfect, deadly, and utterly horrifying. Hendricks had been flying combat missions for 8 months, long enough to understand that war meant killing, that hesitation got you killed, that the enemy would show no mercy if positions were reversed. He had bombed targets from altitude, attacked airfields, strafed ground positions. But this felt different. From 20,000 feet, bombing was abstract. You released ordnance on coordinates, watched explosions bloom far below, and flew home. The targets were map references, not people. Even strafing ground positions allowed some psychological distance. The target shot back. Soldiers in foxholes or manning guns. Combatants engaged in mutual attempts at killing. But a ship full of men with nowhere to run, trapped on a vessel being torn apart by gunfire and explosions, men jumping into the sea to escape the flames, only to face drowning or sharks or hypothermia, that was slaughter on an industrial scale. Hendricks understood the military necessity. Those troops were heading to reinforce Leh, where they would kill Americans. Better to stop them here than face them in the jungles of New Guinea. The logic was sound. The execution was brutal. He glanced at his co-pilot, Lieutenant Raymond Foster, and saw his own troubled expression mirrored there. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say that would make it better. The radio crackled with updates from other crews. Captain Mitchell reporting transport sinking by the stern. Lieutenant Krause calling hits on a destroyer that had tried to screen the convoy. Major Benson coordinating the withdrawal, ordering aircraft to form up and head home before Japanese fighters could arrive from Rabaul. The professionalism in those voices, the matter-of-fact reporting of devastation, spoke to how thoroughly these men had absorbed the lessons of their training. They had a job to do, and they did it with skill and precision. The cost to their souls could be tallied later. Sergeant Howard Chang sat behind Hendricks manning the upper gun turret, scanning the sky for threats. He had fired perhaps 50 rounds during the attack, suppressive fire directed at a destroyer's bridge to keep their anti-aircraft gunners pinned down. It had worked. The destroyer's return fire had been wild and inaccurate. Now, Chang watched the burning convoy with Seed behind them and thought about his family in California, about the internment camps where Japanese Americans were being held, about the complicated hatred that drove this war. His grandparents had emigrated from Japan 40 years ago, seeking opportunity in America. Now their grandson was helping to kill Japanese soldiers. The irony was not lost on him. Back at Port Moresby, the returning crews were greeted as conquering heroes. Intelligence officers debriefed them immediately, gathering details about the attack, confirming kills, assessing damage. The numbers were staggering. 8 transports destroyed or sinking, multiple destroyer hits, minimal Allied losses, just 3 aircraft damaged, none lost. It was the kind of victory ratio that made headlines, the kind of success that justified every dollar spent developing new tactics and modifying aircraft. General George Kenney, commander of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, was ecstatic. He had championed the Strafer concept, had supported guns modifications over the objections of traditionalists who thought low-level attacks were suicidal. Now he had vindication. The Strafers worked. The doctrine was sound. The Japanese supply line to New Guinea was severed. But Kenney was experienced enough to understand what his crews had done and what it cost them. He made a point of visiting the squadrons that evening, not for official congratulations, but simply to talk with the men. He found them subdued, drinking more than usual, speaking in low voices about what they had witnessed. Kenney did not offer platitudes about necessary sacrifices or the greater good. He simply acknowledged that they had done something difficult, that it would stay with them, and that their service mattered. Some of the younger pilots found solace in his words. Others remained haunted. For the Japanese survivors clinging to wreckage in the Bismarck Sea, the hours after the attack were a descent into hell. The warm water that had seemed almost pleasant initially became a torment as the sun climbed higher, beating down without mercy. Dehydration set in quickly. Men who had swallowed seawater during the sinkings became violently ill, retching and weakening. Sharks appeared, drawn by blood and the thrashing of wounded men. The predators circled, occasionally darting in to take a victim. Screams echoed across the water as men disappeared beneath the surface. Private Hiroshi Takeda floated on a piece of decking torn from the Kembu Maru, sharing the makeshift raft with 3 other soldiers. They had watched their ship roll over and sink within minutes of being hit, had jumped into the water with hundreds of others, had swum desperately to find anything that would float. Takeda was 19 years old, conscripted 6 months earlier from his village in rural Honshu. He had never seen the ocean before joining the army. Now he was adrift in it, watching men he had trained with die from wounds or exhaustion or despair. One of his raft mates, a corporal from Osaka, simply let go of the decking and slipped beneath the waves without a word. Just gave up. The other 2 tried to grab him, but he was gone before they could react. They did not speak about it afterward. What was there to say? The destroyers that had survived the initial attack attempted rescue operations, but Allied aircraft returned repeatedly, forcing them to maneuver and defend themselves rather than pull men from the water. Each time the destroyers approached a cluster of survivors, aircraft would appear, and the warships would have to choose between rescue and survival. They chose survival, racing away from the swimming men whose hopes rose and fell with each approach and withdrawal. Some soldiers, understanding that rescue was not coming, began swimming toward New Guinea, dozens of miles distant. Most did not make it. Their bodies joined the others drifting in the current. Captain Kenji Yamamoto commanded the destroyer Shikanami and bore responsibility for the convoy's protection. He stood on his bridge watching the sea fill with survivors and felt the weight of failure crushing him.
Convoy he had sworn to protect was annihilated. Thousands of men were dying because his anti-aircraft defenses had proven inadequate. He had followed doctrine, had positioned his destroyers according to established procedures, had done everything his training and experience dictated, and it had not been enough. The Americans had changed the rules, had introduced a form of attack his forces were unprepared to counter. Doctrine written for high-altitude bombers and torpedo planes was worse than useless against strafers. Yamamoto wanted to remain in the area, to rescue as many men as possible, regardless of the cost. But he also had to consider his responsibilities. If his destroyers were sunk attempting rescue, those men would die anyway, and the warships would be lost as well. The strategic calculus was brutal but clear. He ordered his remaining destroyers to withdraw toward Rabaul, taking with them the few hundred survivors they had managed to pull aboard. It was the correct decision, the only rational decision, and it felt like damnation. He would carry the faces of the men he left behind for the rest of his life. Kapitän Vollmer, rescued by Yukikaze on March 4th after spending nearly 2 days in the water, was in poor condition. Sunburned, dehydrated, suffering from exposure and mild hypothermia despite the warm water, he was taken to the ship's medical bay where corpsmen treated his injuries. He drifted in and out of consciousness, reliving the attack in fever dreams, hearing again the roar of engines and the scream of machine guns. When he finally stabilized, the ship's captain visited him and asked for a report. Vollmer described what he had witnessed as accurately as his battered mind could manage. The captain listened in silence, his expression growing darker as Vollmer explained how the strafers had approached at wave-top height, how they had saturated targets with machine gun fire before releasing skip bombs, how the anti-aircraft defenses had been unable to track targets moving so fast and so low. When Vollmer finished, the captain asked if he was certain about these details. Surely some exaggeration had crept in, some confusion, born of trauma and fatigue. Vollmer met his eyes and said there was no exaggeration. Every word was truth. The Americans had developed a new form of attack, and Japanese forces had no answer for it. The report Vollmer submitted upon reaching Rabaul should have triggered immediate changes in Japanese convoy tactics and defenses. It was detailed, accurate, and supported by testimony from other survivors.
But the Imperial Japanese Navy was an organization resistant to admitting failure or accepting that its doctrine might be flawed. Senior officers read Vollmer's report and questioned its conclusions. Some suggested he had panicked during the attack and misremembered events. Others argued that the convoy's loss was due to bad luck or poor execution by the destroyer captains, not to any fundamental inadequacy in their defensive systems. The idea that American medium bombers had been transformed into ship killers seemed fantastical, the kind of claim that did not merit serious consideration. This institutional blindness cost Japan dearly in the months that followed. More convoys were dispatched to New Guinea using the same tactics and formations that had failed so catastrophically at Bismarck Sea. More convoys were attacked by strafers. More ships were sunk. More soldiers drowned. The pattern repeated with grim regularity until the Japanese Navy finally accepted that their methods were obsolete and began implementing changes. By then, it was too late. Allied air superiority was so complete that even improved defenses could not protect convoys operating in daylight. The Japanese resorted to running supplies in fast destroyers at night, a far less efficient method that could never match the tonnage carried by transport ships. The logistical strangulation of Japanese forces in New Guinea became inexorable. The Strafer crews continued flying missions throughout 1943 and into 1944, attacking shipping wherever they found it. Each mission followed the
Same pattern. Intelligence identified targets, fighter escorts cleared the air, and the strafers went in low and fast, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water. The results were consistently devastating. Japanese sailors learned to fear the sight of B-25s approaching at sea level, learned that once the strafers began their attack runs, survival was largely a matter of luck. Some ships were hit and sank immediately. Others absorbed damage and limped home. A few escaped unscathed. But the psychological impact was universal. Every convoy voyage became an ordeal of tension and dread, waiting for the moment when dots appeared on the horizon and resolved into predators closing in for the kill. Lieutenant Hendricks flew 42 missions before his tour ended in October 1943. He returned to the United States, was decorated for valor, and spent time training new crews in the tactics that had proven so effective. He found it difficult to convey to fresh-faced pilots what combat was actually like, how the training was necessary but could not truly prepare you for the reality of killing, how success in combat often felt hollow, how the faces of the enemy haunted you regardless of the righteousness of your cause. He did his best to teach them the mechanics of skip bombing and low-level strafing, the importance of coordinated attacks, the need to press home your run even through heavy fire. But the deeper lessons, the psychological ones, those could only be learned through experience. After the war, Hendricks struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. He married, had children, worked as a civil engineer designing bridges and highways. On the surface, his life was normal and successful, but he carried the memories of the Bismarck Sea with him always. At night, sometimes, he would wake from dreams of burning ships and men in the water, would lie in the darkness and wonder if those Japanese soldiers had families who still grieved for them, if their widows blamed him personally, if their children grew up hating the Americans who had killed their fathers. There were no good answers to these questions, no absolution to be found. He had done his duty, had helped shorten the war, had saved American lives by taking Japanese ones. The mathematics of war suggested he should feel proud. But war's mathematics never quite added up when calculated in human terms. Sergeant Chang remained in the Pacific for the duration of the war, flying missions until Japan's surrender in August 1945. He witnessed the island-hopping campaign, saw Rabaul isolated and bypassed, participated in strikes against shipping throughout the Southwest Pacific. When the war ended, he returned to California to find his family released from internment, but their property confiscated, their lives disrupted, their status as Americans questioned despite his service. The irony was not lost on him. He had risked his life fighting for a country that imprisoned his family for looking like the enemy. It took years for him to process that contradiction, to come to terms with what his service meant. Eventually, he concluded that he had fought not for the government that interned Japanese Americans, but for the ideal of what America could be, should be. It was a fragile reconciliation, but it allowed him to find some peace. Captain Yamamoto survived the war and returned to Japan to find his homeland in ruins. The naval service he had devoted his life to no longer existed. Its ships sunk, its personnel scattered, its pride shattered. He worked in reconstruction, helping rebuild Japan's merchant marine, and occasionally spoke to students about his experiences. When asked about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, he was candid about the defeat and the lessons it offered. The Americans had demonstrated superior innovation and adaptability. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.